The Wyoming sun hammered down on the desert floor with merciless intensity, turning the red earth to powder and the air itself into a shimmering furnace. 8-year-old Marion Moreau pressed herself against the sandstone outcropping, her small body, trembling as rifle shots cracked overhead like breaking bones. Each bullet chipped away fragments of her shelter and her courage, leaving her trapped between the unforgiving rock and the men who wanted her dead. Her screams had long since faded to whimpers, her throat raw from terror and the desert heat. The clay drinking cup her father had made special for her, decorated with strange scratches around its rim that he'd said would keep her safe, slipped in her sweaty palms as she clutched it to her chest, like a shield against the nightmare unfolding around her. 50 yards away, her mother Genevieve lay motionless beside their overturned wagon, blood trickling from where Luke Patterson's rifle butt had split her scalp. The 28-year-old widow had thrown herself between the mounted attackers and her daughter. But love was no match for 3 armed men with murder in their hearts. "Come on out, little girl." Patterson's voice carried easily across the barren landscape, his distinctive limp not slowing him as he stalked toward Marion's hiding place. "Your daddy owes us something, and we aim to collect. The easy way or the hard way don't matter to us." Marion whimpered and pressed deeper into the meager shade, her green eyes wide with the kind of terror that aged children beyond their years. She didn't understand what these terrible men wanted, only that they'd hurt Mama and were coming for her with their guns and their cold, empty eyes. 3 miles north, following an old game trail through the maze of arroyos that scarred this desolate country, Toddy heard the gunshots echo off the canyon walls. The 25-year-old Lakota warrior had been tracking a wounded elk since dawn, reading its story in drops of blood on red stone and the occasional hoofprint in alkaline dust. His buckskin jacket and leggings, decorated with beadwork his sister had sewn before the fever took her, allowed him to move like smoke through the landscape. The Spencer carbine model, 1865, 56 rimfire in his weathered hands, was loaded and ready in this country. A man who relaxed his guard was a man who died. The rifle shots came from the direction of the freight road, sharp and urgent against the desert silence. 3 shots, as then 4, then something, that made his blood run cold, the high, desperate cry of a terrified child. Every instinct told him to keep moving to avoid the complications that came with white man's troubles. He'd been running from false accusations for weeks, staying ahead of cavalry patrols who believed Deputy Bruno Krantz's lies about stolen horses. Getting involved would mean exposure questions, possibly a rope around his neck in some territorial courthouse where Indian testimony carried no weight against white men's sworn statements. But that scream cut through his caution like a blade. It sounded exactly like his sister's daughter had sounded when the fever dreams took her 2 winters past while he hunted far from camp. He'd returned to find small hands gone cold and bright eyes closed forever, carrying guilt that gnawed at him like wolves in the long darkness. Another shot. Another cry, weaker now, more desperate. Toddy's jaw clenched as something deep in his chest made the decision his head couldn't. Some burdens chose you rather than the other way around his grandfather had taught him. Some paths opened only once, and if you didn't take them, they closed forever. He was moving before conscious thought caught up, flowing down the rocky slope with the fluid grace of a born predator. His trained eye read the tactical situation below 3 mounted men with rifles, 1 woman down, but breathing 1 child trapped behind inadequate cover while armed killers closed in. The Spencer came up smooth and sure, its familiar weight settling against his shoulder. The warning shot kicked up a geyser of dust between Patterson and the child, the heavy 56-56 report echoing like thunder off the surrounding cliffs. "That's far enough." His voice carried clearly in the thin air, speaking English with the careful precision of someone for whom it was a learned tongue. Below, the 3 attackers spun toward the sound weapons swinging up as they searched for the threat. Marion's head snapped up at that calm, steady voice. Through her tears, she saw a figure descending the slope, an Indian warrior in traditional dress, moving with the deadly grace of a hunting cat. Terror and hope warred in her 8-year-old heart as their eyes met across the furnace air. But something in his dark gaze reminded her of her father reading bedtime stories of gentle hands that had never raised in anger. Not the savage she'd been taught to fear, but someone who might understand what it meant to be small and afraid in a world full of violence. Luke Patterson cursed and tried to bring his rifle to bear. "Show yourself, you red bastard. Come down here and die like a man." Toddy was already in motion, reading the men's positions and intentions with a warrior's trained eye. 3 against 1, but they were overconfident and poorly positioned. The kind of mistakes that got cocky men killed when they faced someone who understood violence as both art and necessity. "Problem is," he said, conversationally, never breaking stride, "I don't much care for grown men threatening children." Clubfoot Charlie Morrison, recognizable by his specially constructed left boot, wheeled his horse for a flanking shot. "This ain't your fight, savage. Best move along while you still can." "Can't do that." Toddy's finger found the Spencer's trigger, and something in his posture made Charlie's mount shy nervously. "That little one reminds me of family." The third man, Deputy Bruno Kranz, his tarnished badge catching the harsh sunlight, raised his .44 revolver with cold calculation. "Kill him, Luke. Do it now before he gets any closer." What erupted next was violence in its purest form, brutal and sudden as a prairie thunderstorm. Patterson's Colt revolver cleared leather first, but Toddy had read the killing intent in his pale eyes and was already moving. The Spencer roared its massive bullet, catching Patterson in the shoulder and spinning him like a child's toy. Blood sprayed across his horse's neck as he screamed and toppled from the saddle. Charlie Morrison had better reflexes, his Winchester Model 1873 rising toward the warrior's chest, but Marion chose that instant to break from cover. Terror overrode caution as she ran directly toward the gunfight, seeking the only protection she could see in this hellish landscape. Without hesitation, Toddy dropped his rifle and swept the child up in one fluid motion, his body becoming a living shield between her and the remaining weapons. Charlie's shot went wide as he tried to avoid hitting the girl, the bullet whining off stones somewhere behind them. Deputy Kranz had been circling wide with predatory patience, using his authority and position to line up the perfect killing shot. Now his .44 spoke the slug, punching through Toddy's right shoulder and spinning him halfway around. But the warrior kept his feet, kept his protective grip on Marion, and somehow found Patterson's dropped Colt with his left hand. "Enough," he said quietly, blood soaking through his buckskin jacket. The single word carried absolute finality. Next man moves, dies where he stands. The desert fell silent except for Patterson's moans and the restless stamping of spooked horses. Charlie Morrison clutched his rifle arm where Toddy's return shot had creased him, whimpering like a kicked dog. Deputy Kranz sat his mount with calculation in his cold eyes, weighing odds that had suddenly shifted against him. Marion trembled in Toddy's protective embrace, her clay cup somehow still intact in her small hands. Blood from his wound was soaking into her calico dress, but she felt safer than she had since the nightmare began. "Are you hurt bad?" she whispered, looking up into his pain-tightened face. The warrior's harsh expression gentled as he met her frightened gaze. Despite the fire in his shoulder, despite the blood running down his arm, he managed what might have been a smile. "I've been hurt worse, little bird. You're safe now." She studied his dark eyes with the piercing honesty that only children possessed, seeing past the war paint and eagle feathers to the kindness beneath. "You're not scary at all," she said with 8-year-old certainty. You're good, like Papa was good. The simple trust in those words hit Toddy harder than any bullet. This child's faith cut through the barriers he'd built around his heart, reminding him why some fights were worth having regardless of the personal cost. Marion? The weak call came from the overturned wagon, where Genevieve was struggling to sit up blood, matting her brown hair, but her eyes blazing with maternal fury and relief. Mama. Marion would have run to her mother, but Toddy's gentle hand kept her steady. Easy, little one. Let me check her wounds first. His dark eyes found Genevieve's across the dust and heat. You took a hard blow to the head. Can you stand? Genevieve nodded carefully, accepting Toddy's offered hand as he helped her to her feet. His grip was strong and steady, calloused from years of hard living, but surprisingly gentle. As he steadied her swaying form, their eyes met and held for a moment longer than necessity required. Thank you, she whispered, her voice hoarse with dust and emotion. I don't know how to repay. No debt. He replied simply, his accent making the words sound formal despite their meaning. Any decent person would have done the same. Deputy Kranz spat tobacco juice into the red dirt, his face twisted with frustrated rage. This ain't over, Indian. Jack Moran don't forget, and he sure don't forgive. You just signed your own death warrant. Toddy met the deputy's hate-filled stare without flinching. Been carrying one of those for weeks thanks to your lies about stolen horses. What's one more enemy in a country full of them? You'll find out soon enough. Kranz gathered his reins, signaling to the wounded Charlie Morrison. Help me get Luke across his saddle. We're heading back to town. As the three men rode away, Patterson barely conscious and bleeding heavily, Charlie cradling his wounded arm, Toddy allowed himself to slump slightly against the wagon. The bullet wound was bleeding freely, and black spots danced at the edges of his vision. Marion noticed immediately, her small hand touching his uninjured arm with surprising gentleness. You're hurt worse than you said, she accused. Maybe a little, he admitted, then accepted the clay cup she offered with grave ceremony. The water was warm and tasted of earth, but it was given with such innocent generosity that it might have been the finest wine. As he drank, he noticed the scratches around the rim, more clearly deliberate marks that seemed to form some kind of pattern. Your father made these, he asked quietly. Marion nodded solemnly. He spent hours working on it before he gave it to me. Said he wanted it to be extra special, extra strong. He promised it would always keep me safe. Genevieve had been gathering their scattered belongings, moving carefully due to her head injury. There's a doctor in Bear Creek, about 20 miles south, she said, studying the spreading bloodstain on Toddy's jacket with growing concern. Dr. Petrov is a good man. He won't ask too many questions. Toddy considered this, weighing his need for medical attention against the risk of exposure in a frontier town where his face might be on federal wanted posters. But the wound needed tending, and the woman and child couldn't survive alone in this harsh country with Moran's men hunting them. Bear Creek's where I was headed anyway, he said finally. Needed supplies before the snows come. Then we'll travel together. Genevieve's voice carried quiet determination. It's the least I can do for the man who saved our lives. As they hitched the surviving mule to their battered wagon and prepared for the long journey south, none of them noticed the lone rider watching from a distant ridge. One of Moran's scouts had witnessed the entire confrontation, and he was already spurring his horse toward Bear Creek, with news that would set larger and deadlier plans in motion. The first skirmish was over, but the real war was just beginning. The journey to Bear Creek took them through some of the harshest country Wyoming territory had to offer, a landscape that seemed designed to kill anything foolish enough to cross it. They traveled by night when possible, hiding during the day. In whatever shelter the unforgiving land provided, shallow cave stands of stunted pine-dry washes that offered concealment from watching eyes. Toddy's shoulder wound made every mile an ordeal, but he bore the pain in stoic silence, more concerned with scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit than tending his own injuries. Genevieve had fashioned a sling from strips torn from her petticoat, and she changed his bandages each morning with hands that grew steadier as the days passed. "You should have been a doctor," he observed on their second morning, wincing as she cleaned the wound with precious water from their dwindling supply. "I wanted to be once," she replied, her fingers gentle but thorough as she examined the healing tissue. "Back in St. Louis before I met William and came west. My father said it wasn't proper work for a lady." "Your father was a fool," Toddy said quietly, then caught himself. "Forgive me. I had no right." "No, you're absolutely right." Genevieve's smile was sad, but genuine. He was a good man in many ways, but he couldn't see past what society expected. William was different. He saw what I could be, not just what I was supposed to be. They were camped in a shallow cave overlooking the Sweetwater River, hidden from the main trail by a screen of cottonwoods. Marianne sat nearby, carefully washing her clay cup in a puddle of spring water while humming a song her father had taught her. "Tell me about him," Toddy said, surprising himself with the request. "Your husband. What kind of man was he?" Genevieve was quiet for a long moment, her hands stilling as memories played across her face. Patient. Kind. He could read the land like other men read books, knew where to find water, where the good hunting was, how to read weather in the way clouds formed over the mountains. A useful man to have in this country? Yes, but more than that. He saw possibilities where others saw only problems. When we first came to Bear Creek, the mine at Tombstone Ridge was considered played out. Other miners had given up on it. But William studied the geology, the way the silver veins ran through the rock, and he was convinced there was more to be found. Toddy absorbed this information, filing it away, with everything else he'd learned about the family he'd chosen to protect. "The men who attacked you, they believe he found something valuable." "I think he did." Genevieve's voice dropped to a whisper, mindful of Marian's presence nearby. "Before he died, he told me that if anything happened to him, I should trust the cup, that it would show me the way to take care of Marian's future." "The scratches on the rim." "I think so." William was always drawing maps, making measurements. He had a surveyor's training from back east. She paused, watching her daughter play in the dappled sunlight. "I just wish I understood what he was trying to tell me." That afternoon, while Genevieve rested and Marian napped in the cave's cool interior, Toddy taught the little girl some basic skills for surviving in the wilderness. How to move quietly through underbrush, how to find water by watching the flight patterns of birds, how to distinguish between edible and poisonous berries. "Papa tried to teach me some of this," Marian said as Toddy showed her how to make a snare from twisted grass. "But he said I was too little to remember everything." "You're not too little now," Toddy replied seriously. "In this country, everyone needs to know how to take care of themselves." Marian nodded with 8-year-old gravity, then looked up at him with those disconcertingly direct green eyes. "Are you going to stay with us, even after we get to the doctor?" The question caught him off guard. That's not for me to decide, little bird. Your mother might have other plans." "Mama likes you," Marian said with the casual certainty of childhood. "I can tell. She looks at you the way she used to look at Papa sometimes when she thought I wasn't paying attention." Toddy felt heat rise in his cheeks, grateful for the bronze complexion that hid his embarrassment. "Your mother is grateful because I helped you." That's different from other feelings. Is it? Marion's head tilted thoughtfully. I think grown-ups make things more complicated than they need to be. From the mouth of babes, Toddy thought, watching the child return her attention to the grass snare. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps adults did overthink things that should be simple. But the world had a way of making simple things complicated, especially when they involved a Lakota warrior and a white widow in territories where such combinations could get people killed. That evening, as they prepared to resume their journey under cover of darkness, Genevieve joined him at the cave entrance where he stood watch. The setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful and deadly as everything else in this harsh country. She told me about the tracking lessons, Genevieve said quietly. Thank you for being patient with her. She's a quick learner, smart like her parents. You mean like her father? There was no bitterness in the correction, just weary acceptance of her own limitations. No, Toddy said firmly. Like both her parents. You've kept her alive and hopeful in circumstances that would break most adults. That takes intelligence and strength. Genevieve was quiet for a moment, studying his profile in the fading light. You don't talk like the stories say Indians talk. What stories? The ones in the newspapers back east, about noble savages who speak in grunts and gesture with their hands. She flushed slightly. I'm sorry. That was thoughtless. Not thoughtless. Honest. Toddy's smile held no offense. I learned English from missionaries at the reservation school. They believed education would make us more civilized. Some of my people thought it was a betrayal of our ways. What did you think? I thought knowledge was power, and my people needed all the power they could get. His expression grew distant. I was right about the knowledge part. Still learning about the power. They traveled through the night, making good time, across relatively flat ground that allowed their wagon to roll smoothly, despite its battered condition. Toddy walked alongside most of the way, his shoulder too painful to endure the constant jarring of the wagon's seat, while Genevieve handled the mule with surprising skill. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in pale rose and gold, the first buildings of Bear Creek became visible in the distance, a collection of weathered structures that seemed to cling to existence through sheer stubborn will. There, Genevieve said with obvious relief. Dr. Petrov's clinic is the narrow building next to Henderson's general store, the one with the painted sign. Toddy studied the town with a warrior's eye, noting sight lines and escape routes from habit. Bear Creek looked peaceful enough in the early morning light, but he'd learned not to trust appearances in country where a man's life could change in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Are you ready for this? Genevieve asked, following his gaze. Ready for what? For people to stare. For whispers behind hands. For the looks they'll give a white woman traveling with an Indian. Her voice was steady, but he caught the underlying tension. Are you? He countered gently. Genevieve was quiet for a long moment, watching Marion sleep peacefully in the wagon bed, still clutching her clay cup even in dreams. A week ago, I would have said no, she admitted finally. But a week ago, I thought the world was full of enemies and empty of heroes. You've changed my mind about a lot of things. As they rolled down Bear Creek's single main street in the early morning, quiet more than a few early risers stopped their activities to stare at the unlikely trio. But Toddy found himself less concerned with their curious glances than with the knowledge that somewhere in this dusty frontier town, Jack Moran was planning his next move in a game where the stakes were nothing less than life and death. The real test was just beginning. Dr. Joseph Petrov's clinic occupied a narrow slice of Bear Creek's main street, squeezed between Henderson's General Store and Murphy's Saloon, like an afterthought in a town that seemed to specialize in them. The Russian immigrant had come west with dreams of striking it rich in the gold fields, only to discover that his medical training from St. Petersburg was worth more than any claim he might stake. The doctor himself was a compact man in his 40s, with graying hair and hands that had seen too much frontier surgery. When Genevieve knocked on his door in the early morning light, he opened it with the automatic wariness of someone who'd learned that unexpected visitors often brought unexpected trouble. His eyes took in the blood-stained warrior, the injured woman, and the frightened child in a single professional glance. "Inside quickly," he said in accented English, stepping aside to let them enter. "Mrs. Moreau, yes, I heard about trouble at Willow Springs yesterday." "You know who I am?" Genevieve asked, surprised. "Small town. Word travels fast, especially when it involves gunfights and federal wanted men." Petrov's gaze settled on Toddy with more curiosity than hostility. "Though from what I hear, the wanted man turned out to be the hero of the piece." "I wouldn't go that far," Toddy said quietly, accepting the doctor's assistance onto the examination table. "No 3 armed men against one, and you walk away while they flee bleeding." Petrov began cutting away the makeshift bandages with practiced efficiency. "In my country, we would call that heroic. Here, I suppose people will find other words." Marion had settled into a chair near the window, her clay cup cradled in her lap, as she watched the medical procedure with solemn fascination. The child had said little since they'd entered town, but her green eyes missed nothing. "Will he be all right?" she asked in a small voice. "He will be fine, little one," Petrov assured her, probing the bullet wound with gentle fingers. The slug passed clean through without hitting bone. Painful but not dangerous if we keep it clean. As the doctor worked cleaning and stitching the wound with careful precision, other members of Bear Creek's small community began to arrive. Word of their presence had spread quickly through the close-knit town, bringing both the curious and the concerned. Dorothea Fleming was the first, a tall, angular woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that suggested she'd seen more of the world than most frontier schoolteachers. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room she entered. "Mrs. Moreau," she said formally, offering her hand. "I'm Dorothea Fleming, the town schoolteacher. I've been following your situation with considerable interest." "My situation?" "Your husband's death, the circumstances surrounding his mining claim, the convenient way certain officials seem to have profited from the tragedy." Dorothea's voice carried the crisp precision of an educated woman who chose her words carefully. "I've been corresponding with territorial authorities about irregularities in local mining operations." Genevieve felt a spark of hope. "You believe William was murdered. I believe your husband discovered something valuable enough to kill for. The question is whether we can prove it before Jack Moran eliminates all the witnesses." Before anyone could respond, heavy footsteps approached outside, followed by the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather. Through the clinic window, they could see a group of mounted men assembling in the street, too many and too well armed to be coincidence. "Company!" Toddy observed his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle, despite the pain in his shoulder. Dr. Petrov moved to the window, his face grim, as he recognized the riders. "Jack Moran. And he's brought half his crew." The mining boss sat his horse like a king, surveying his domain, his massive frame radiating the kind of casual menace that came from years of getting his way through intimidation and violence. Even at a distance, his presence seemed to suck warmth from the morning air. "He can't do anything in broad daylight," Genevieve said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Not with federal investigators asking questions." "Nor can't he?" Dorothea's smile was bitter. Jack Moran owns half the officials in this territory and has dirt on the other half. Federal investigators are just another obstacle to be managed. A sharp knock rattled the clinic door, followed by a voice that carried the weight of assumed authority. "Dr. Petrov, open up official business." The doctor exchanged glances with his patients, then moved to answer the summons. Deputy Bruno Krantz stood on the threshold, his tarnished badge catching the morning sunlight and his hand resting meaningfully on his gun butt. "Morning, Doc?" Krantz said with false pleasantry. "Heard you might have some patients I need to question." "Good morning, Deputy," Petrov replied carefully. "What can I do for you?" "Well, for starters, you can step aside and let me talk to that Indian you're harboring. Got reports he attacked 3 citizens yesterday in an unprovoked assault." Toddy rose from the examination table, despite the doctor's restraining hand, his shirt still unbuttoned to reveal the fresh bandages. "Unprovoked. That what Patterson told you?" Kranz's eyes narrowed. "Luke Patterson is a respected member of this community. You're a wanted horse thief with a price on your head. Whose word you think a territorial court's gonna believe? Perhaps they'll believe mine." The new voice came from behind Kranz, and everyone turned to see a young army officer approaching on foot, his blue uniform marking him as federal cavalry. Lieutenant William Morrison wore his authority lightly, but there was steel beneath the pleasant demeanor. "Lieutenant," Kranz said, surprise and calculation warring in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you in Bear Creek." "Following up on some reports about mining irregularities in the area," Morrison replied evenly. "Seems the territorial government wants to ensure proper procedures are being followed." Kranz's face went pale. "I don't know what you've been told, but everything here is strictly legal and above board." "I'm sure it is." Morrison's smile never wavered. "That's why I'm here to document that fact for my superiors. Mrs. Moreau, I believe you have information relevant to my investigation." Genevieve felt her heart race with sudden hope. "Information. But how did you—" "Someone's been writing very detailed letters to territorial authorities," Morrison explained, glancing meaningfully at Dorothea. "Letters that raise serious questions about certain mining accidents and their aftermath." Jack Moran had dismounted and approached the clinic, his presence filling the doorway like a malignant shadow. "Lieutenant Morrison, is it? I don't believe we've been introduced. Jack Moran, owner of the Tombstone Ridge mining operation." "Mr. Moran." Morrison's voice remained cordial, but his hand moved closer to his service revolver. "I understand you knew the late William Moreau." "Poor William. Tragic accident, that mining explosion. Man should have been more careful with his blasting charges." Moran's eyes found Marion, who was sitting quietly in her chair, still clutching her cup. "Left behind a widow and child with nothing but debts from what I hear." "Actually," Genevieve said, rising to her feet with newfound courage, "William left us more than you know." Moran's attention focused on her with predatory intensity. "Did he now? That's interesting, seeing as how he died owing me considerable money. Money I'm legally entitled to collect from his estate." "What estate?" Dorothea interjected coolly. "From what I understand, a mining explosion destroyed everything in the claim area. Very convenient, wouldn't you say?" "Convenient." Moran's facade of civility began to crack. "Lady, I don't know what you're implying, but—" "I'm not implying anything," Dorothea replied crisply. "I'm stating facts. William Moreau died in a mining accident that destroyed all evidence of his work. His claim was then transferred to you through documents that appear to have been signed after his death. The whole situation stinks of fraud and murder." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from gunpowder. Even Kranz looked uncomfortable with the direct challenge to their carefully constructed lies. "That's a serious charge, school marm," Moran said quietly, his voice carrying the barely controlled violence of a man unused to defiance. "You better be able to back it up with proof." "Perhaps I can," Genevieve said, her voice steadier than she felt. She held up Marion's clay cup, turning it so the scratched markings caught the light. William left evidence, proof of his original claim and his discoveries at Tombstone Ridge. Something flickered in Moran's eyes, recognition mixed with hunger and fear. His gaze fixed on the simple pottery vessel with the intensity of a starving man seeing food. "That cup belongs to me," he said softly, all pretense abandoned. "Everything William owned when he died reverts to paying his debts to my company. Even his daughter's personal belongings," Lieutenant Morrison asked mildly. "Even those?" Moran stepped into the clinic, uninvited, his bulk seeming to shrink the space. "I've got legal documents to prove it." "Forged documents," Dorothea said firmly. "Prove it." Moran's smile was cold as winter wind. "You got any evidence these supposed documents are fake? Any witnesses to this supposed murder? Any proof beyond the word of a grieving widow and a meddling schoolteacher?" The challenge lay between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Genevieve felt her hope beginning to waver as she realized how little solid evidence they actually possessed. Documents could be forged, witnesses could be bought or intimidated, and the dead told no tales. But then Marion spoke up, her 8-year-old voice cutting through the adult tension with devastating clarity. "Papa said you were a bad man," she told Moran matter-of-factly. "He said you wanted to steal what he found, but his cup would keep us safe. He made it extra special, extra strong just for me?" Moran's face flushed with rage at being challenged by a child. "Your papa was a fool who got too greedy for his own good. Hand over that cup, little girl, and maybe I'll let you and your mama walk away from this." "No." Marion's grip tightened on the pottery vessel. "It's mine. Papa gave it to me, and you can't have it." "Can't I?" Moran's hand moved toward his gun, and suddenly the clinic erupted into tension as Toddy stepped protectively in front of the child. "Touch her and die," the warrior said quietly, his voice carrying absolute conviction despite his wounded state. Lieutenant Morrison's revolver appeared in his hand with practiced speed. "I think that's enough excitement for one morning. Mr. Moran, I suggest you and your men return to your business and let me conduct my investigation in peace." For a moment, violence trembled in the air like heat shimmer over sun-baked earth. Moran's hand hovered near his weapon, while his eyes calculated odds that had suddenly shifted against him. But the presence of federal authority, even a single cavalry officer, changed the equation significantly. "This isn't over," Moran said finally, his voice thick with suppressed fury. "Not by a long shot." "No," Toddy agreed, meeting the mining boss's hate-filled stare. "It's not." As Moran and his men withdrew, their threats echoing in the morning air, Lieutenant Morrison holstered his weapon and turned to the others. "I think it's time we took a closer look at that cup," he said quietly. "And perhaps paid a visit to Tombstone Ridge. If there's evidence to be found, we'd better find it before someone decides to destroy it permanently." But even as they began to plan their next move, none of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows across the street. One of Moran's spies had heard enough to know that their boss's carefully constructed empire was in mortal danger. The real war was about to begin, and it would be fought not just with guns and violence, but with the kind of evidence that could hang a man or set him free. The cup Marion clutched so protectively held secrets that could change everything if they lived long enough to unlock them. The decision to examine Marion's cup in detail came after careful consideration of their limited options. With Moran's men watching the clinic and the morning's confrontation having drawn battle lines clearly, Lieutenant Morrison suggested they needed somewhere more secure for their investigation. Jebediah Cross offered his farm as a meeting place. The wheat farmer lived 3 miles east of town on a spread that had been in his family since the early days of Wyoming Territory. More importantly, his property included a root cellar that could serve as both hiding place and fortress if Moran decided to escalate his campaign of intimidation. They traveled separately to avoid attracting attention. Dr. Petrov left first, ostensibly making house calls to patients in the rural areas. Dorothea followed an hour later, carrying her school books, as if heading to visit a student's family. Toddy, Genevieve, and Marion waited until afternoon before slipping out the clinic's back door and making their way through the maze of back alleys that connected Bear Creek's scattered buildings. Jebediah's farm was a modest but well-maintained operation, with fields of winter wheat that rippled like golden water in the constant Wyoming wind. The farmhouse itself was built of local stone and timber, designed to withstand the territory's harsh weather and the occasional Indian raid that had been more common in earlier years. "Welcome to my humble home," Jebediah said as he greeted them at the door. "Not much to look at, but it's honest work and honest ground." The farmer was a man in his 50s, weathered by years of fighting the land for his living. His hands were permanently stained with soil, and his face carried the deep lines that came from squinting into prairie sun and wind. But his eyes were kind, and when he looked at Marion, his expression softened with grandfatherly affection. "Now then, young lady," he said seriously, "I hear you've got something mighty important in that cup of yours." Marion nodded solemnly, holding up the pottery vessel for his inspection. "Papa made it special for me. He said it would always keep me safe." "Did he now? Well, your papa was a smart man. Shall we see what he left for you?" The root cellar was accessed through a heavy wooden door set into the farmhouse floor. Stone steps led down into a cool, dry space that Jebediah used for storing preserved foods and seed grain. Oil lamps provided flickering illumination as the small group gathered around a rough wooden table. "Before we begin," Lieutenant Morrison said formally, "I want everyone to understand that what we discover here may be used as evidence in federal court. We need to document everything carefully and ensure that proper legal procedures are followed." Dorothea had brought paper and ink for record keeping, while Dr. Petrov provided magnifying glasses and surgical instruments that might be needed for delicate work. Toddy positioned himself near the cellar entrance, his rifle ready despite his wounded shoulder. Marion placed her cup on the table with ceremonial gravity, then stepped back to watch as the adults examined her most precious possession. The clay vessel was perhaps 4 inches tall and 3 inches across at the rim, decorated with the geometric scratches that had first caught their attention in the desert. "The markings are definitely intentional," Dorothea observed, running her finger along the etched lines. "They form a grid pattern with specific reference points marked at regular intervals." Lieutenant Morrison studied the cup through one of the magnifying glasses. "Survey coordinates, I'd guess. But coordinates to what?" "Only one way to find out," Dr. Petrov said, examining the vessel's construction with a physician's trained eye. "This cup has a double wall. See how thick the base is compared to the rim. There's definitely a hollow space inside." Working with infinite care, they began the delicate process of opening the cup's hidden chamber. Dr. Petrov used a thin-bladed scalpel to probe along the base until he found what felt like a seam in the clay. A gentle twist revealed that the bottom of the cup was actually a carefully fitted plug sealed with wax and designed to be removed by someone who knew the secret. Marion held her breath as the adults worked her small hands clenched together, as she watched them disassemble her father's final gift. "You won't break it, will you?" she whispered. "We'll be very careful." Genevieve assured her daughter, though her own heart was racing as the cup's secrets were slowly revealed. The hidden chamber contained exactly what they'd hoped to find, and more than they dared expect. Wrapped in oiled silk were several documents written in William's careful handwriting, along with a small object that made Lieutenant Morrison whistle softly in surprise. "Well, I'll be damned," the officer said, holding up a piece of pure silver ore, unlike anything they'd ever seen. The metal had an unusual greenish tint that spoke of rare mineral content, and it was shot through with veins of what looked like gold. "Electrum." Dr. Petrov breathed his scientific training, helping him identify the precious metal. Silver and gold naturally alloyed together. It's extremely rare and incredibly valuable. "This came from Tombstone Ridge?" Dorothea asked, examining the ore sample through her magnifying glass. Genevieve unfolded one of the documents, her hands trembling slightly as she read her dead husband's words. According to this, William found a vein of electrum ore running through the deepest part of the mine. He estimated it could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. "Enough to kill for," Toddy observed grimly from his position by the cellar entrance. The other documents were equally damning. William had meticulously recorded his dealings with Jack Moran, including the mining boss's increasingly desperate attempts to force a sale of the claim. More importantly, he documented Deputy Kranz's role in the conspiracy, not just as a bribed official, but as Moran's active partner in the scheme to steal legitimate mining claims throughout the territory. "Look at this," Lieutenant Morrison said, studying a hand-drawn map that showed the underground layout of Tombstone Ridge. "Your husband documented the entire vein structure. This map shows not just where the electrum deposit is located, but how to access it safely." "And this," Dorothea added, holding up another paper, "is a sworn statement naming Bruno Kranz as the official territorial inspector who verified William's original claim. If Kranz was working with Moran from the beginning, then every document they've produced to support their version of events is fraudulent." Marion had been following the adult conversation with the intense concentration she brought to everything important. "Does this mean Papa's treasure will help us catch the bad men?" "I think it does, little bird," Toddy said gently. "Your father was even smarter than we knew." But their celebration was premature. The sound of approaching horses broke through the afternoon quiet, growing louder as multiple riders approached Jebediah's farm at a gallop. "Company?" the farmer said grimly, peering up through the cellar door. "And they don't look friendly." Toddy was already moving, his warrior instincts taking over despite his wounded condition. "How many?" 8, maybe 10. All armed. Jebediah's voice was tight with fear and anger. "Moran's men by the look of them." The sound of boots on the porch above was followed by a hammering on the farmhouse door. Jack Moran's voice boomed through the wooden walls, carrying the arrogance of a man who'd never been successfully defied. "Cross open up. We know they're in there." "What do we do?" Genevieve whispered instinctively, moving closer to Marion. Toddy's mind raced through their tactical options. The root cellar was easily defended, but also a trap. One entrance meant no escape if their enemies decided to smoke them out or simply wait for starvation to do their work. "The evidence," he said quietly. "We need to get it to federal authorities before Moran can destroy it." Lieutenant Morrison nodded grimly. "My horse is in Jebediah's barn. If I can reach it, I can get word to my commanding officer at Fort Laramie." "You'll never make it past Moran's men on your own," Dorothea said practically. "Then we create a distraction." Toddy replied, checking his Spencer carbine despite the pain in his shoulder. Something to draw their attention while the lieutenant escapes. The hammering on the door grew more insistent, followed by the crash of splintering wood as Moran's patience ran out. Heavy footsteps echoed through the farmhouse above as armed men began searching for their quarry. Down here. Someone shouted, and the sound of boots on the cellar steps announced that their hiding place had been discovered. The first man down the stairs never knew what hit him. Toddy's rifle butt caught him in the temple, dropping him unconscious before he could raise an alarm. But there were too many others behind him, and soon the cellar erupted into chaos as gunfire filled the confined space with smoke and deadly projectiles. Dr. Petrov cried out as a bullet grazed his arm, while Dorothea proved she was more than just a schoolteacher by producing a small pistol from her skirts and returning fire with deadly accuracy. Jebediah had found an old shotgun somewhere and was blazing away at the cellar entrance, his farmer's determination proving as fierce as any soldier's training. Through it all, Genevieve shielded Marion with her body, while Toddy fought with the desperate skill of a warrior who knew this might be his last battle. But they were outnumbered and outgunned, trapped in a space that offered no room for maneuver and no hope of escape. Just when it seemed that all was lost, a new sound cut through the chaos, the clear, commanding voice of federal authority backed by military discipline. "This is the United States Army. Lay down your weapons and surrender." The gunfire faltered as Moran's men found themselves caught between the defenders in the cellar and a troop of cavalry soldiers who had seemingly appeared from nowhere. Through the confusion, Lieutenant Morrison's voice could be heard shouting orders and demanding the immediate arrest of everyone involved in the attack. When the smoke finally cleared and the prisoners were secured, the survivors in the root cellar emerged, and to find that help had arrived in the form of Morrison's commanding officer and a full cavalry patrol. The lieutenant, it turned out, had indeed been in contact with Fort Laramie all along. He had sent a courier 2 days prior and wired a telegraph from the last station on the road. Reinforcements had been dispatched the moment word reached them of the situation in Bear Creek. Jack Moran stood in shackles beside his captured men, his face purple with rage as he realized that his carefully constructed empire was collapsing around him. Deputy Kranz had tried to flee during the confusion, but had been caught before he could reach his horse. "It's over," Morrison told them as they gathered in Jebediah's farmyard. "We have the evidence, we have the witnesses, and we have the criminals. Federal marshals are already on their way to take custody of the prisoners." Marion ran to her mother, throwing her arms around Genevieve's waist as the magnitude of their survival began to sink in. The little girl's clay cup, miraculously intact despite the violence, sat safely in her mother's hands. Its secrets finally revealed its promise, finally fulfilled. "Is it really over?" Marion asked, looking up at the adults with eyes that held too much knowledge for her 8 years. "It's really over, sweet one," Genevieve assured her, though her own eyes were fixed on Toddy, as he leaned heavily against the farmhouse wall, his wounded shoulder having taken a toll during the fighting. But even as federal justice began to assert itself and the immediate danger passed, questions remained about the future. What would happen to the mine claim? Now that the truth was known, what would become of the relationships forged in the crucible of shared danger? And most importantly, what kind of life could a Lakota warrior and a white widow build together in a territory where such unions were both rare and dangerous? The answers to those questions would have to wait. For now, it was enough that they had survived, that justice would be served, and that William Moreau's final gift to his family had proven as protective as he'd promised it would be. The cup had kept them safe, just as he'd said it would. But the real treasure it contained wasn't gold or silver. It was the truth that had set them free, and the bonds of trust and affection that had grown stronger with each shared trial. As the afternoon sun slanted across Jebediah's wheat fields and federal soldiers secured the scene, Marion clung to her parents, both the memory of the father who died protecting her and the living presence of the man who'd chosen to continue that protection and felt for the first time since the nightmare began truly safe. The weeks following the arrest of Jack Moran and his accomplices brought changes to Bear Creek that transformed the dusty frontier town almost beyond recognition. With the corruption exposed and honest officials taking over the territorial administration, legitimate mining operations began to flourish throughout the region. The Moreau claim at Tombstone Ridge proved even richer than William had documented. The electrum vein he'd discovered was indeed one of the most valuable mineral deposits ever found in Wyoming territory, worth enough to make Genevieve and Marion wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. But more importantly, it validated William's sacrifice and ensured that his killers would face justice for their crimes. Jack Moran himself was sentenced to hang after a swift but thorough federal trial. The evidence from the cup combined with testimony from Dr. Petrov, Dorothea Fleming, and other witnesses painted a clear picture of murder fraud and conspiracy that no amount of legal maneuvering could dispute. Deputy Bruno Krantz received a life sentence in the territorial prison, his career in law enforcement ending in disgrace and confinement. For Toddy, the resolution brought both vindication and uncertainty. The false charges against him were formally dropped, and he received an official pardon from the territorial governor for any alleged crimes. But freedom to travel didn't necessarily mean freedom to belong, especially for a Lakota warrior in a society that viewed his people with suspicion and hostility. The question of his future became more pressing as his shoulder healed and his physical strength returned. He could leave Bear Creek, return to his people, or strike out for new territory, where his skills as a scout and guide would be valued. But all of those options meant leaving behind the woman and child who had become more important to him than his own life. The conversation that would determine their future took place on a crisp autumn evening, as they sat on the porch of Genevieve's new house, a modest but comfortable home, purchased with the proceeds from the first sale of electrum ore from the mine. Marion was inside practicing her letters under Dorothea's patient instruction, her voice carrying through the open windows as she recited the alphabet. "The federal marshals want to hire me as a scout," Toddy said quietly, watching the sun set over the distant mountains. "Good pay, steady work, and a chance to help keep the peace in the territory." Genevieve felt her heart clench at the careful neutrality in his voice. "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity." It would mean traveling, long periods away from Bear Creek. Not much of a life for a man who wants to put down roots. "Is that what you want, to put down roots?" Toddy was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the gold and crimson light of the setting sun. "I want what I've never been able to have before. A home, a family, a future that stretches beyond the next sunrise." "Those things are possible," Genevieve said carefully. "But they would require sacrifices from both of us. Compromises that might be difficult to make. Such as the fact that a marriage between us would close certain doors forever. There are places we could never go, people who would never accept us, opportunities that would be denied to Marion because of her mixed family." Toddy nodded slowly. "I've thought about that. But there are other doors that would open. Other opportunities that come from bringing different strengths together." "The mine, you mean?" "Not just the mine. Though I think your husband was right about the deeper veins holding more treasure. With proper security and the right kind of management, that operation could employ half the territory and bring prosperity to everyone who's willing to work for it." Genevieve studied his profile in the fading light, seeing not just the warrior who'd saved her life, but the thoughtful man who'd spent weeks caring for her daughter and planning for their future. "You've given this considerable thought." "I've given it all my thought," he admitted. "Since that first day in the desert, when Marion offered me water from her cup. I knew then that my life had changed forever. The question is whether you want the same change. Before Genevieve could answer, Marion burst through the door with the explosive energy that only 8-year-olds possessed. Mama Toddy, Miss Dorothea, says I can read a whole page now without making mistakes. Want to hear? Of course, sweet one, Genevieve said, grateful for the interruption that gave her time to think. Marion launched into a careful recitation of a story about a brave princess who saved her kingdom through cleverness rather than force. As she read, Toddy found himself thinking about the parallels, how this child had helped save them all, through her father's hidden gift, how intelligence and courage could triumph over brute strength and corruption. When Marion finished her reading and went back inside to help Dorothea prepare supper, the adults were left alone again with their unfinished conversation. She needs stability, Genevieve said finally. After everything she's been through, Marion needs to know that the people she loves won't disappear from her life. I'm not going anywhere, Toddy replied firmly. If you'll have me, if you think we can make this work, then I'm here for as long as you want me. It won't be easy. People will talk, opportunities will be limited, and there will always be those who see our marriage as something wrong or unnatural. Let them talk. Toddy's voice carried quiet conviction. I've spent most of my life worrying about what other people thought, trying to find my place in a world that seemed determined to reject me. I'm tired of that. I want to build something new, something that belongs to us. Genevieve was quiet for a long moment, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. William used to say that the best treasures were hidden in the most unlikely places. I think he would have liked you. I hope so. I want to honor his memory, not replace it. You're not replacing anything, Genevieve said softly, turning to face him fully. You're adding to it, building on the foundation he left behind. The kiss that followed was different from their first tentative contact weeks earlier. This one carried the weight of decision, the commitment of two people who understood the challenges ahead, but were willing to face them together. When they broke apart, both were breathing heavily, and Genevieve could see her own wonder reflected in Toddy's dark eyes. So, she said with a shaky laugh, I suppose this means we're engaged. I suppose it does, he replied, his arm tightening around her waist. Though, I should probably ask your daughter's permission first. She seems to have strong opinions about family matters. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Marion appeared in the doorway, with her clay cup in her hands. The vessel that had started their adventure was showing signs of wear chips from bullets and rough handling, but it remained intact, still serving its purpose as the child's most treasured possession. Are you two getting married? She asked with 8-year-old directness. Would that be all right with you? Toddy asked seriously, kneeling to bring himself to her eye level. Marion considered this with the gravity she brought to all important decisions. Will you be my new papa? I'd be honored to be your papa, Toddy replied gently. But I can never replace the father you lost. He'll always be part of who you are. I know that, Marion said matter-of-factly. But Papa's gone to heaven, and you're here. And Mama's happy when you're around, and so am I. So I think it's a good idea. She held up her cup, studying the scratched markings that had revealed so many secrets. Besides, Papa's cup brought you to us. Maybe that was part of his plan all along. It was a child's logic, innocent and profound, in the way that only children could manage. But as Toddy looked at the simple pottery vessel that had changed all their lives, he found himself believing that perhaps Marion was right. Perhaps William Moreau had indeed planned for more than just the preservation of his mining claim. Perhaps he'd found a way to ensure that his family would never be alone, even after death had claimed him. 6 months later, on a spring morning when the Wyoming wind carried the scent of new grass and endless possibilities, Toddy and Genevieve were married in a simple ceremony beside the Cheyenne River. Marion served as maid of honor, her new dress the color of prairie wildflowers and her smile bright enough to shame the sun. The wedding was small but meaningful, attended by the friends who had stood with them during their darkest hours. Dr. Petrov served as best man, while Dorothea Fleming provided music on a portable pump organ borrowed from the church. Jebediah Cross gave the bride away, standing in for the father who couldn't be present. Lieutenant Morrison, now promoted to captain for his role in exposing the territorial corruption, officiated at the ceremony under territorial authority, with the marriage recorded by the county clerk. The legal authority he represented ensured that their marriage would be recognized throughout the territory regardless of local prejudices. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Marion stepped forward during the exchange of vows, offering her clay cup as a symbol of the family that was being created. "Papa's cup kept us safe until you found us," she said seriously, looking up at Toddy with eyes that held wisdom beyond her years. "Now it can help keep us all safe together." The Moreau Running Wolf Mining Company, as it came to be known, became one of the most successful operations in Wyoming territory. Under Toddy's security expertise and Genevieve's business acumen, the Electrum mine produced wealth that benefited not just their family, but the entire community of Bear Creek. More importantly, it proved that different cultures could work together for mutual benefit. Toddy hired both white and Indian workers, creating one of the first truly integrated businesses in the territory. The success of their operation opened doors for other mixed families and helped break down some of the barriers that had long divided Wyoming's diverse population. Marion grew up to become a teacher like Dorothea, but she also learned the skills her stepfather taught her, tracking, hunting, and the deep wisdom of living in harmony with the land. She became a bridge between two worlds, comfortable in both, but belonging fully to neither, and perhaps stronger for that independence. As the years passed and Bear Creek grew from a rough frontier town into a prosperous community, visitors would sometimes ask about the clay cup that sat in a place of honor on the mantelpiece of the town's most successful family. The cup was chipped and worn, showing the scars of its adventures, but it remained Marion's most treasured possession. She would tell them the story of how her father's final gift had saved her family and brought them together with a Lakota warrior who'd chosen love over safety, justice over revenge. How a simple piece of pottery had contained not just evidence of mineral wealth, but proof that the most valuable treasures were often hidden in the most ordinary places. And sometimes on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered across the prairie and the stars painted patterns in the infinite Wyoming sky, Marion would hold her father's cup and remember the promise he'd made when he gave it to her, that it would always keep her safe. He'd been right, but not in the way either of them had expected. The cup hadn't protected her through magic or supernatural power, but through the love and sacrifice of people who'd chosen to stand together against the darkness. The real treasure it contained wasn't gold or silver, but the bonds of family and the understanding that sometimes the most unlikely combinations created the strongest alliances. William Moreau's promise lived on in the daughter who carried his memory, the wife who honored his sacrifice, and the warrior who'd chosen to continue his protection. The clay cup sat safely on its shelf, its secrets revealed, and its purpose fulfilled, a testament to the power of love, to transcend death and the courage of those who fought to protect what mattered most. In the end, that was treasure enough for any lifetime.